We said to people, since there's nothing called business as usual, everything we do is a working hypothesis. We won't know whether our decision or that action we took really worked until we get feedback on its impact. So the real key is how fast can we get feedback and know what our impact was as a leadership team, and then how do we adapt?
Hey everyone, I'm Randi Larson from the Generative AI Innovation Center at AWS. We're capturing the raw, unfiltered conversations that tell you what the what is when it comes to AI. Something is shifting in the way organizations are being led, and not enough people are talking about it. This may very well be the most consequential leadership story of this AI moment. The thing is, the question of whether AI will transform how businesses operate, well, that's pretty well settled. What isn't settled is what this moment will ask of the people who are leading through it. Because it's about whether you can lead with conviction when most of the answers haven't even arrived yet. This episode is for the people tuning in who want to find that kind of clarity. Fortunately, I couldn't have asked for two sharper minds to have as guests for this conversation. My guests today are Linda Hill, who chairs the Leadership Initiative at Harvard Business School, among many other things, and Shaun Collett, our forward-deployed engineering lead, also from the AWS Generative AI Innovation Center. So thrilled to have both of you here.
Thank you.
It's a privilege. Thank you. I'm Shaun. It's great to spend time with both of you today. Like Randi said, I've been with Amazon for 9 years. I work in AWS professional services for the Gen AI Innovation Center, and I've spent my entire career in technology. I would say the first half of it was deep in the coding and building technology, but I had a moment as a CTO prior to joining Amazon where I got the opportunity to really transform an entire suite of businesses and change how they operate through the use of technology. And it got me completely mesmerized with the psychology of business and culture, and how do you help people go from a previous state to a current state and see performance that maybe they didn't think was possible.
It's a pleasure to be here with both of you. And as you said, I'm a professor at Harvard Business School, and I chair the Leadership Initiative. And in many ways, the Leadership Initiative is an innovation lab and an accelerator for the entire business school to make sure that we educate leaders who make a difference in the world. So I spend my time working mostly with the MBAs and with executives, but I also have founded two organizations with my former students. They're my bosses, which is always an interesting experience. And I also like to write always with a young person. So my current book I wrote with a Gen Z individual who keeps me honest and is trying to make me learn how to do vibe coding and put me on TikTok. And I also always write and work with executives. And so one of the executives I've worked with the longest was the chief technology officer at Pixar. And he is a person who really helped me understand the intersection of leadership and innovation, which has really been my focus for the last 20 years.
So I do want to dig into this because that's, even for both of you, just a really concise version of your decorated, accomplishments in this space. But Linda, clearly you went into this with some premonition of what it takes to lead during these hard times. But as you dug deeper into that research, it sounds like there was something that challenged your assumptions, something, maybe a lot of things that surprised you. Tell us more.
Actually, I, in fact, don't know that I deeply believed in leadership when I came to Harvard Business School. I was recruited by a man named John Cotter, and John is one of the individuals who taught us about the difference between leadership and management. I'm an organizational anthropologist, and I also thought I would work in public health, but I found business so exciting. So when he invited me to come be at the school and work with him for a while, and I saw what he was studying about leadership and management, I found it quite intriguing because I wasn't sure that I thought leadership was all that important. I will tell you, I realized it was very important mostly when I became a trustee of the Rockefeller Foundation, and I began to see how individuals made such a difference to their communities, to their countries, etc. When I began to look at leading innovation, even though all the leaders that we have written about have been visionaries, that is not how they saw their role. And that surprised me because I thought about it in that way and I had sort of grown up with that point of view. But leadership in that model is more about followership. And leadership when you're leading innovation is more about how do you get people to co-create the future with you, not follow you to the future. And that is a very different mindset and requires some different skills.
It's not necessarily just having the vision, but it's acting, it's collaborating. And that's what I'm hearing you say.
Well, the thing about it, for sure, all leaders these days, frankly, have to be able to lead change and lead innovation.
Sure.
So what we ended up doing is thinking of leadership in a very different way. And we talk about it as being 3 imperatives. Leadership is always about managing yourself, figuring out how to use yourself as an instrument to get things done. And leadership is always about an emotional connection. So how do you make that emotional connection? The second imperative of leadership is really managing networks, managing those relationships with people over whom you have no formal authority, but you're deeply dependent on to get your job done, both inside and outside the organization. And finally, the third imperative is managing your team or managing relationships with people who do, in fact, report to you. Now, we made that one the last one, not because it's the least important, but when I ask people what is leadership, they all look down. They all think about the people who report to them. Many people don't think about the network. In fact, they think about the network as kind of the ugly politics of organizational life. And then I think thanks to emotional intelligence, many people do look at themselves and understand that. That wasn't always true, but I think that is something that organizations and people do think about a lot. We have to think about how do people experience us and how do people experience themselves when they're with us. So there is that component. The network part, which really relates to what we're going to talk about today, is not something that is embraced by all, but is really critical to making sure we use all these emerging technologies to make a difference to our clients and other stakeholders.
So, Shaun, when you're seeing all of this in the field, conceivably, you're having a glimpse into something very similar. What I want to know is, when you're deep in the trenches, implementing AI at some of these really complex organizations, working on some of those complex engagements, is what you're seeing, in fact, similar? What
I'm seeing today in terms of, what most organizations are doing is that they're teaching AI to their employees. And, they're, showing them what is context engineering or prompt engineering? How do you do vibe coding? And what very few organizations are doing is educating their leaders on what the demand of AI takes to actually transform your company. And even rewind a couple of years ago, the belief was, there's almost FOMO around artificial intelligence. If I'm not a part of it, I don't know if my company is going to exist. And so it was, do I have the latest model? Do I know exactly, how to use this? But in reality, AI is not a technology race. AI is actually a business success race. And I think if we look back at history, we realize that if you build the best technology in the world and you have the best model in the world, it doesn't mean your business is going to be successful. Transformation really starts in the business. This doesn't start with technology. And the best companies that I'm seeing thrive out there are the ones that can bridge business and technology together. A good example is business lending. A lot of companies, a lot of banks and financial institutions around the world are taking a look at this. It's a beautiful use case for artificial intelligence and Gen AI because it uses both objective and subjective data. And traditional business loans take between 45 and 90 days to be reviewed and approved across 12 different job functions, maybe 25 to 30 or 40 different people have to touch this. And there's 70% idle time, 30% actually work time. And we were able to reinvent this, to have it done in as little as 4 to 8 hours with 4 different agents.
Wow.
And so when you think about what does business in the future look like, you really have to question every different aspect of business. And are leaders in these businesses educated enough to be prepared to reimagine their businesses, reimagine job functions and KPIs and goals and organizational structures to be able to get this done?
I agree with you completely. In fact, the last book that we wrote, Genius at Scale, is about how not only do you develop innovative solutions, but perhaps more importantly, how do you turn them into reality? And when you look at the implementation side, of course, for both sides, you have to think about leadership. But what we see is that, just like you've said, people think it's about developing literacy about these new technologies. And that is a piece of the puzzle.
It's a piece.
But you want people to be willing and able to at least try to use these technologies to make a difference. Then what you need to think about is how do you get people to be learners? How do you get people to be agile and adaptive? And that really goes back usually to the culture of the organization, not so much that individual. We often think, oh, that person's resisting, whatever, that's the bad person. But it's often something about our context that leads people not to be as open as they might be to at least trying these new technologies and reimagining their work as a consequence of playing with them a bit. And I think that's one of the dilemmas we have. We don't get to play with things and become more comfortable with them and then figure out for ourselves and use our own imaginations to think about how might this help me do what I want to get done better.
I love that. And it's not about waiting for mastery before you can actually claim that you've used it and you've had hopefully, some success with it. It really is that struggle that gets you into the learning zone.
And I think that what you see in these contexts is what are the incentives we're really giving people to take the risks to try something new and something that is actually pretty scary. The model of leadership that we are trying to develop at the moment is one that we call wayfinding, as opposed to pathfinding. So for sure, leading change is really, really hard. In our language, that is about pathfinding. You kind of know your destination, you have a vision, and what you need to figure out is how you're going to get there and how you're going to get others to want to get there with you. So that is very hard. Wayfinding is when you don't actually know the destination nor how you're going to get there. And it's more like, the people who were explorers who got into a ship and went out, maybe looking for the new world, weren't sure if the world was flat or round or whatever. So they had various tools, the stars, et cetera, to help them figure out and pivot. One leader that we studied, he was at the time the CEO of Cleveland Clinic Abu Dhabi. He said to me one day, Linda, I feel like I'm leading through a fog. What does it mean to lead when you can't see, when you have no vision?
Wow.
And I think when you talk to many leaders nowadays, they will admit to you, at least in private, they can't see and they have no vision. So what does it mean to lead in those circumstances? And that's what I think. We don't really know where AI is going. We don't really know, how our work will be reconfigured. We don't know what the workforce is going to look like. So how do we help people feel safe enough to try something about which there is tremendous amount of anxiety, if not fear? That is the emotional side of leadership.
So Linda, when you think about, those top performers, you found in your research that, in fact, these stars really aren't the most equipped to lead their teams through times of innovation. Why is that not the case?
One of the challenges you have when you're a visionary is making space for other people. And the other thing is, if you are a visionary, to really admit that you actually can't see. So the person I'm telling you about who said he was leading through a fog is a Rhodes Scholar, very, very capable individual, pioneer in robotic surgery, et cetera. So not used to not having an answer. And often too many stars think they're supposed to have the answer, they're supposed to have the vision, and they really struggle when they don't. So he had to stretch his own leadership style. So he said to people, since there's nothing called business as usual, everything we do is a working hypothesis. And then you can design rigorous and relevant experiments. You can help people learn how to do that and understand that that's what we're doing. And the other thing he said, which I think probably in your own work, is how do you get people to accept this if they're used to getting A's? You need to understand that fundamentally, as he said, we won't know whether our decision or that action we took really worked until we get feedback on its impact. So the real key is how fast can we get feedback and know what our impact was as a leadership team, and then how do we adapt accordingly? Either we'll get the feedback and it says you're on the right path, keep going, or you need to pivot. So to have that kind of mentality and how you help people in a hospital, usually very hierarchical, Abu Dhabi, which is a pretty hierarchical place too, to understand you are supposed to be thinking about, we're all working on this together. We're all going to be innovators together because it's nothing business as usual. We all have to learn how to rely on the scientific method, do things in a way we're collecting data, doing the analytics. But you know what? In the end, the best decision making is both rational and emotional. And that emotional needs to go back to what our purpose is, why we find our work meaningful, who we really are supposed to be taking care of.
That's useful. There's something about naming a situation. Everything's just a working hypothesis, because suddenly it builds this sense of psychological safety that, oh, okay, now I can make mistakes. I liked how you mentioned that. Shaun, I want to give this next one to you, and I want to level set here for a minute. For those of you tuning in, the next time you find yourself at an inflection point or just a tension-filled moment, I want you to pause and ask yourself, is this a capacity issue or a capability issue? And Shaun, you're going to tell us why this matters.
So where do you focus your time and energy? How I really broke it down with my team in the past is this kind of intersection of capability and capacity, where most organizations, because it's easy to measure, focus on building capability. Capability are the skills that you have, whether I understand supply chain optimization, or whether I can write code proficiently, or whether I'm a good business writer. They focus on building capabilities. Really, in this world of knowledge abundance, it used to be that knowledge was scarce. And if you had knowledge, that was a valuable resource. But with AI now, it's getting smarter and smarter and smarter. So knowledge really isn't the differentiator. So what is the differentiator? And that's really what I'm referring to when I talk about leadership capacity. That's how you lead when times are hard. So how do you show up for yourself, for your team, for your business? Dimensions like resiliency, emotional intelligence. How do you make decisions under uncertainty, right? I heard something the other day that I loved, which was conviction through ambiguity, right? As a leader, like how do you remain convicted when things are uncertain? And so often organizations look to people that had independent success as a capability and say, hey, I'm going to put you in a leadership position. And those are the people that, because they were personally successful, may struggle to actually lead a large team of people through this type of change. How do you actually look at people that maybe don't have as high of capability, but do have a high capacity to lead others and help them build a capability? And they actually may be more likely to accelerate into kind of this model where you have both.
I can't help but think about this term that you brought up, Linda, called bridgers. When I think about this term, first of all, I think they must be exhausted because they need to have, kind of bridge the gap between the business and the technical, and also the internal teams, right, and the external partners. And the thing is, leaders know that there's a gap, right, where you need this type of archetype, this type of individual. But why does this gap keep widening?
One of the things that we actually see is most organizations, as you get bigger, do have more specialization. You break into silos, whether it's by function, by geography, by business unit or markets. And once you get all that complexity, to find people who actually can keep the big picture and understand enough about the enterprise, what the enterprise is about, and then know how to work across the boundaries of that enterprise, nonetheless work with partners outside the organization. I think that what we see is people aren't rewarded for that. So one of the other organizations we had the pleasure of studying, we studied a particular leader, the person at the time who was the head of R&D and innovation. So at some point, Procter & Gamble wasn't growing at the rate it needed to grow according to the market. And so they ended up with an activist on their board. And when Kathy, who was the head of innovation at the time in R&D, she realized in part that people were waiting for R&D and the innovation group to come up with that killer product, right? And she began to say, no, that's not it. What we need to be working on is, first, everything we do needs to be irresistibly superior. And it's about the emotional connection. And you know what? It's not just R&D. It's about the experience. We've moved from a product economy to an experience economy. So it's an end-to-end kind of thing. So she realized, as did the C-suite, we all need to work very differently. And a lot of the change of how they needed to work was actually very consistent with what needs to happen to be ready with AI. I remember Kathy said to us, I don't want you to write anything about technology. It's not a technology problem, Linda. It is a cultural problem. And one of the things we do is we tell people, come here, you can be a game changer, we want you to innovate. But then we turn them into what we call value creators. Now, you need people who are value creators. Value creators are people who know how to figure out this is where we are and this is where we should be. And we all need to be able to do that in our roles. But game changers are people who think about this is where we could be, not where we should be. And when people attempted to try to close those could gaps, and if they missed and had a misstep, which of course you have because you're experimenting to learn to do it, they got punished by the organization. And so I think what we see, going back to the capacity of leadership, is that many organizations are saying, in the end, we're part of the problem. And that's not an easy thing to ever admit, particularly if you were always a type A person and you were somewhat perfectionistic, and that's what, that's led to your success, to say, we've got to look at how we're doing our work differently, and we need to share our 360-degree feedback with our people to tell them we need to learn too, and we're not perfect. doing all of that is unnatural. But they needed to be really the role models of showing people that we're not perfect, we have to learn. We've got to be in it. Unless the C-suite is actually experimenting with these new technologies, people don't really see them as very authentic in the messages they're sending about why the rest of you need to be doing this. Mm-hmm. So I think that what we find is that the leaders, as they implement these changes, they begin to find out, oh, this is also about me. And that's not easy. Because, again, you're not used to, as a leader, not knowing, not being perfect, all of those. I mean, many leaders are in certain companies. I want to be clear about that, but that's not what we usually think about when we think about a great leader.
And how wonderful when you're part of a team where the leaders are self-reflective like that. There's this fear of negative perception and seeking it out. And what if I, hear something I don't want to hear? But your teams are still watching and they're still noticing. It takes a special person to look inward.
Yeah, and just a very specific example, and actually going back to Cleveland Clinic Abu Dhabi, one of the things that began to happen there is that the nurses, everyone in the hospital is called a caregiver, so they all have, so the nurses begin to call the digital team and say, you know what, I don't particularly care for this dashboard that you've sent down. We'd rather have the data over here, or we'd rather have these data, et cetera. Now, at first, some of the people thought, well, this is, they're critiquing my work. On the other hand, what they're really doing is telling you, we value what you're creating.
Exactly.
More of it, actually. With
all of this said, I want to pivot a little bit. John, when we see these teams that are experimenting with AI, you talk about continuous learning and wanting to learn by doing. We often see that they're using tools that are kind of not ordained by the company. And, some leaders might think, oh, we've got to clamp this down. Like this can't keep happening. I think you may have a slightly different read on it. Tell me your thoughts there.
We're really on the precipice now where everyone is becoming technical. Now with AI, anyone has the ability to write code. They have the ability to build their own applications. And there's actually some amazing things that are being built. And where technology and agentic platforms are coming, we're not far away. And in fact, a lot of people have this today, have the access to do that exact thing. There's this concept that's becoming more popular. We used to call it shadow IT, where when the lines of business, when central IT wasn't moving fast enough, lines of business would hire their own IT people, and we called that shadow IT. The centralized IT didn't like that because then they weren't following standard policies and standard regulations and keeping data safe. And now at this day and age, we have shadow AI, where this is the unsanctioned use of AI tools within the line of business, because for line of business, they want to move. They want to get business done. They're usually incentivized on driving revenue and driving margin. The knee-jerk reaction typically from CISOs and CIOs is prohibition, right? You have to stop this. But really, I see it as a demand signal. This is a signal to IT or to CIOs or whoever you want to call upon to say, I think there's a new way to think about this. Instead of thinking about prohibition, how do you have a governed democratic environment for technology and accept this idea that instead of controlling IT like I've done for 30 years, how do I actually govern that and say everyone is now a builder? And you're actually unleashing innovation in a way that has never happened before. So how do you give them the right tools? How do you build the right guardrails to protect and build a blast radius around your company to secure your data and make sure that you're keeping things inside your company that should be, and then build trust in those applications, and then honestly get out of their way. Like if you build that culture and people don't have a fear of failure. I mean, the ability to just write a prompt and have it build an application for you, it's amazing. Someone does that, at 4 p.m. on a Friday, as the week is closing up, they might come up with the next big thing. And so how do I move from a prohibition style to one where I'm unleashing this talent across the entire organization? And so instead of being constrained to, 200 developers, I now have 20,000 developers, all of which that could be building the next big thing.
I agree with you completely, because one of the concerns of professors is students are using AI. And what if they use AI on their exams? What should I be doing with them if I know they're using AI, or some number of them, as opposed to saying to them, you're prohibited, because that never really works. And I think that it means that I need to think very much about how do I use their time wisely. And almost all of us, we might follow the rules, but none of us particularly like to. So that just the act of explaining it makes a difference, we're seeing in companies, and senior executives are pleasantly surprised sometimes. Or in the demand spirit in which you're speaking, why is it that you want to use that tool as opposed to the tool we've made available? And then you listen, hear what that's about, and think, oh, I've just learned something that maybe we should move to that tool.
I think both of you said, at the end of the day, people just want to be heard. And then you can also figure out what's the issue that we're facing, that you can't use the tools that we've provided for you. Oh, well, here's a fix to it. And now you can use it and experiment.
Yeah. There's very reasonable reasons, from financial to security to legal, of why we have these guardrails.
Right.
But if we can say, hey, go to town inside of here with tools that you care about, and you have selection and the ability to do what you want to do and access to data, I think there's a happy middle ground that can unleash a tremendous amount of innovation.
Okay, this is a fascinating topic. So I would love to stay on it, but I want to veer off a little bit here. Shaun, I can't help but think about what we read recently in our shareholder letter. Our CEO, Andy Jassy, was describing this AI inflection, as he put it. And he said that it really isn't just about change management, more so about reexamining our faith. So from your point of view, I mean, that's a powerful statement. What do you think he wanted to land for executives there?
That line caught me also. And I think it ties really closely into what Linda was sharing earlier in this concept of pathfinding versus wayfinding. And change management, in a lot of ways, I have a fair amount of change management over my career, and it assumes that you know the starting point and you understand your destination. So I need to get people from a place to a place, and then my job is done. Re-examining your faith, and I think this is along the lines of wayfinding, is I don't know what the destination is, what questions I'm going to come up with along the journey, what answers I'm going to find, and what those answers are going to do. Right. And so in a lot of ways, you have to believe. I, as an individual, am very convinced, and I think a lot of other executives and people are too, that there is a path there with artificial intelligence and how it's going to reinvent most customer experiences and most business functions, and just how the way that we operate. What I've noticed is that thriving organizations who become more comfortable sitting inside ambiguity and sitting inside uncertainty can pull their teams through it and say it's okay. Right. It's okay, because this is not a linear path, versus running to safety and running to what doesn't work. Nothing replaces getting started and just going and doing it. Right.
Among all the things we're discussing, just getting started and welcoming new ideas, being okay to be wrong, letting go of assumptions we've had. What is one thing, and we can start with you first, Shaun, that each of you has really genuinely had to unlearn? Now, I don't mean update, but kind of let go of entirely to be effective leaders yourselves in this environment.
I think for me, there's kind of two parts to this. The first is I absolutely suffered and still suffer from this idea of needing to be right. And so I started really practicing letting go and not needing to have the answer to things. And it sounds a little bit cliche because this maps back to our conversation perfectly, but probably 4 or 5 years ago, I had to unlearn this idea that I always had to have an answer. I started showing up for my team and my colleagues, and I've extended this to partners and to customers to say that, just so you know, I'm practicing this. I'm practicing evolving my leadership style. I'm practicing the way that I'm communicating. I'm practicing my writing. I'm practicing building agents on the side just to see what that's like. So if you see me show up differently, that's why. One of the most powerful things that I've found recently, and this comes back to the second part, is telling my team members, I don't have the answer. And then offering to them to say, I'm happy to be a thought partner with you to get that answer with you. Or I think that you figure out the answer, right? I'm supportive of you. And if that answer feels uncomfortable for you, come back to me and let's talk about it. But if not, just go. Right. And I think for me, that's unleashed a whole bunch of just momentum with my team that I was probably bottlenecking before.
Yeah. Very, very eloquently said. It's sort of what you've said before, Linda, that for some of the serial innovators who you've come across, they do seem to have this unique relationship to being wrong.
I think I'm somewhat on the opposite end of this. I don't necessarily give enough direction. So it turns out that I have hired many people to work with me and write books with me, going back to working with young people, who I was the only job offer they had. Very common.
Hard to believe.
I say that because then I let them do what they I just said, go do this. So it was funny. I was talking to 2 or 3 of them. I'm still quite close to a number of them. And they said, she sent me to India when I was 24 years old. And I had never been to India or any place and didn't really have a passport. But she said, okay, go and, talk to the CEO. He'll take very good care of you. I mean, someone I knew. I usually assume people are very capable and will figure it out and resourceful. So I think probably I need to give more direction.
Yeah, it takes just finding the right balance.
Yeah.
But, I will say, I think I went into this conversation thinking that we were going to walk out with tips for how to have conviction. But the theme that I think keeps emerging that I'm really pleased to see is that really everything should be, to your point, a working hypothesis, right? Working hypothesis. So practice vulnerability, practice asking questions, name it. Anybody listening can borrow our belief that that's the path forward. Well, it's been a pleasure, Shaun, Linda. Such an intriguing conversation, and I'm just really grateful that you joined me here today.
Well, thank you for inviting me, and I'm so glad to get to know you.
Likewise. Thank you.
Thank you.